Zootopia 2 has come home to Disney+.
Let's go!
Get ready for a new case.
We're the greatest partners of all time!
New friends.
Gary the Snake.
And your last name?
The Snake.
Dream Team.
New habitats.
Zootopia has a secret reptile population.
You can watch the record-breaking phenomenon at home. Zootopia 2, now available on Disney+, rated PG. And right now you can get Disney Plus and Hulu for just $4.99 a month for 3 months with a special limited time offer. Ends March 24th. After 3 months, plan auto renews at $12.99 a month. Terms apply.
This episode is brought to you by Cologuard. Do you know what's really scary? Not screening for colon cancer when you turn 45. The Cologuard test is non-invasive, requires no special prep or time off work, and ships right to your door. In just 3 simple steps, Cologuard takes the scare out of colon cancer screening. If you're 45 or older and at average risk, ask your healthcare provider about the Cologuard test. Cologuard is available by prescription only. Learn more or request a prescription today at Cologuard.com/screen.
Welcome back, True Crime Army. I am your host, Margot, and this is Military Murder, a show where I discuss true crime cases involving military members and veterans, all with one goal in mind, to remind us to remain vigilant always. Today, I'm bringing you a story of absolute terror. It is terror at the hands of a Marine veteran who turned what should have been a normal, albeit blistering hot summer day in 1966 into 96 minutes of sheer panic and chaos. From 11:48 a.m. until 1:24 p.m., time simply froze on the campus of the University of Texas at Austin. The main quad below the university's iconic clock tower became a war zone as a sniper positioned 231 feet above the ground fired down on students, staff, and visitors with deadly accuracy. Some armed civilians returned fire, hoping to pin the shooter down and lessen the number of casualties. But despite those efforts, the gunman would ultimately claim 17 lives. Today, I'm walking you through the 1966 University of Texas tower shooting, a case that many historians consider the first modern mass shooting in American history. Now, let's dig in.
Military murder is an independent project and is not endorsed by the Department of Defense or any military component. The views expressed are those of the host. The content of this podcast is not meant to be legal or medical advice. Warning, this episode contains graphic details of murder and is not suitable for young listeners. Listener discretion is advised.
The University of Texas at Austin is a premier public research university. It's known for its top-tier accounting, engineering, computer science, and even business schools. It is located in the heart of Texas, so it offers a blend of traditional campus life with quick access to Austin. UT is famously recognized by its Hook 'em Horns sign and spirited Longhorn culture. And let's not forget the NCAA Division I sports that dominate every single semester. The campus is recognized by its iconic tower with sweeping views of Austin, and that is exactly where I'm taking you today. Our story takes place at the University of Texas Tower in 1966. But the thing about this tower is that prior to the terror of 1966, it had already been a place touched by tragedy. As reported by the Texas State Historical Association and UT's own tower history, in the decades surrounding the shooting, the tower also became associated with multiple suicides. After the 1966 massacre and later suicides from the observation deck, the university ultimately closed the deck to the public in the mid-1970s, and it remained closed until 1999. In 1999, the observation deck reopened, and that same year, the Tower Garden, which was the university's first on-campus memorial to the victims of the tower shooting, was dedicated. That memorial space is often referred to as a garden of reflection. Then, in 2007, a small plaque was added to the garden. And on August 1st, 2016, which marked the 50th anniversary of the massacre, a much larger memorial made of Texas pink granite was dedicated in honor of the victims and all those affected by the tragedy. You see, for decades leading up to this, many felt that the university had not fully confronted what happened that day. But that memorial in 2016, engraved with the names of the murdered victims, became one of the clearest and most visible acknowledgments of the horror that unfolded there. The names reflected on that memorial are Kathy Whitman, Margaret Whitman, Edna Elizabeth Townsley, Mark Jerome Gabor, Margaret Lamport, Baby Boy Wilson, Thomas Frederick Ekman, Robert Hamilton Boyer, Harry Walchuk, Thomas Carr, Karen Griffith, Paul Sontag, Claudia Rutt, Roy Schmidt, Billy Paul Speed, Thomas Aquinas Ashton, and David Gumby. And just to be clear here, David Gumby did not die on August 1st, 1966. He was wounded that day, and he died decades later from the complications tied to the shooting, which is why some sources give different victim totals. But in the long-term accounting of the massacre, his name is included among the murdered victims. Now, let me direct your attention to the summer of 1966. The Vietnam War was raging in the background of world news. The United States had launched Operation Hastings. American POWs were being captured following Operation Rolling Thunder, and 3 soldiers from Fort Hood refused to deploy to Vietnam, becoming some of the first high-profile service members to refuse to go to war. Now, I can't believe that my story is dating back to 1966, and somehow Fort Hood is still leading the way in the news. Well, that's the backdrop of our case today. So it's Monday, August 1st, and on the University of Texas campus, all is calm that morning. Summer classes are in session, and people are simply going about their business, walking across campus, wrapping up tests, studying for upcoming exams, all in full view of the massive tower that stood at the center of campus life. And this is where college couple Claire Wilson and Thomas Ekman were walking and talking. They were both 18 years old, and Claire was expecting her first baby. Claire was 8 months pregnant. Her belly was nice and round. On that hot summer day with temperatures climbing toward triple digits, Claire chose to wear a white dress to avoid trapping the heat. As the baby's due date approached, Thomas asked Claire whether she had eaten enough breakfast that morning because he wanted the baby to be healthy. As they were talking, suddenly there was a crack. At first, it sounded like a firecracker, but at that exact moment, Claire dropped to the ground. Thomas knelt down next to her, not realizing what had happened. Then there was another crack, and suddenly Thomas fell to the ground as well. Then came more cracking sounds. Someone screamed in the distance, and in that moment, pedestrians began to realize that they were not hearing construction noises, they weren't hearing fireworks, they were hearing gunshots. People suddenly scattered, but they could not figure out where the shots were coming from. Pop, pop, pop. More people went down. A student crumbled near a fountain. A professor fell while walking along Guadalupe Street, which is a strip the students called the Drag. It was lined with bookstores and coffee shops. 17-year-old Alec Hernandez was riding his bike delivering newspapers with his younger cousin when he was suddenly hit by a bullet and the bike toppled over. Alec reached for his leg, confused, trying to understand what had just happened. In those first few minutes, the UT campus was transformed into something out of a nightmare, as bodies just kept dropping left and right. Frenzied people dove behind bushes, low walls, and cars. And as the minutes passed, some finally realized that the shooter was at the top of the tower. But here's the thing, as those minutes ticked by, many people on campus along the Drag had no idea what was happening at all because they had been indoors and inside of stores, or they just were far enough away when the shooting and screaming began that they had no idea what was happening. 18-year-old Paul Sontag and his girlfriend Claudia Rutt were both recent high school graduates. Paul had just picked up his paycheck from the pool, and the couple was walking when they suddenly realized something was wrong. They quickly hid behind cover, but then curiosity took over. Paul stood up to get a better look, and in an instant, he was shot in the face. Claudia got up to reach for Paul, and she was shot too. Both of them killed. 29-year-old electrician Roy Schmidt was making a service call to the university when he was stopped by a police barricade. He got out of his car and crouched near it, thinking that he was far enough out of harm's way. But he wasn't. When he exposed himself ever so slightly, he was shot. Sadly, Roy Schmidt would become known as the gunman's most distant fatal target. He was struck from about 500 yards away. 38-year-old PhD student and father of 6, Harry Walchuk, was shot while leaving a newsstand. Now, cell phones did not exist in 1966, and neither did the modern 911 system. So the people who made it safely inside buildings, they began calling police operators, emergency lines, and newsrooms. They were desperately trying to report that there was a shooter on the tower picking people off one by one. My research revealed that SWAT teams did not exist at the time, so when those calls started coming in, police were scrambling. There was no active shooter protocol, no sniper unit, no unified response plan like we expect today. The city of Austin was simply not prepared for what they were now facing. A trained marksman, armed with multiple weapons, positioned 231 feet above the ground, firing indiscriminately with lethal accuracy at distances up to 500 yards. And as police scrambled, word spread quickly across Austin that there was an active shooter. So, what do you think happened as lay people were hearing about a shooter? Do you think that they hunkered down and locked their doors? No way, this is Texas. People had guns in their trucks, in their apartments, in their dorm rooms. And this is where the story takes a turn that I did not expect, because at this point, armed civilians began heading toward the tower. The armed civilians took positions behind trees, cars, and buildings, and they started firing at the observation deck at the top of the tower, bullet after bullet chipping into the limestone. And the fact that everyday citizens took action did two things, right? First, it made the entire scene feel even more like a war zone. Witnesses later described that bullets were pinging off stone, limestone dust clouding the air, and that gunfire was echoing across campus. But the second and most important thing that these civilians did is that they helped control the shooter. Because now the shooter had to move. He had to duck and weave and bob. He had to reposition. He could no longer simply stay exposed and methodically pick people off one by one. So while the civilians added to the chaos, they also disrupted the gunmen enough to save lives. And while they did not stop the shooting completely, many saw them as heroes. And more heroes emerged in the middle of this terror. A young woman named Rita Star Pattern saw that Claire Wilson was still alive, but laying fully exposed to the sniper. So Rita did something unimaginable. She ran to Claire, putting her own life at risk. And then Rita did something almost impossible to comprehend. Not only did she run to Claire, she lay down near her and began talking to her. Claire begged Rita to leave, telling her it was too dangerous as tears just ran down her face. But Rita stayed. She even played dead, all while continuing to talk to Claire, trying to keep her conscious. Nearby, students were hiding behind structures, but they could see victims laying out in the open, exposed to the shooter. They watched as Claire, visibly pregnant, shifted on the burning pavement in obvious distress. Claire would later say that she barely felt the pain of the gunshot wound to her abdomen. Instead, she felt her baby slump to one side inside of her, and in that instant, she knew her baby was dead. She called out to Tom, but he never responded, and she knew right then and there that he was also dead. And still, Rita stayed there beside her, even as the concrete grew so hot beneath them that it felt like it was burning their bodies. The heat in the pavement, by some accounts, felt even more immediate than the bullet wound itself. The students hiding behind cover kept hearing the tower bells ring while they wondered when this terror would end. 15 minutes, 30 minutes, 45 minutes, 1 hour. And then some of them realized it was now or never. That's when 3 young, heroic men gathered every ounce of courage that they had, and they ran straight toward Claire and Tom. They knew that they could be shot in the back at any given moment, and there is actual footage of this heroic moment. You can see the 3 men run out towards Claire. One grabs her by the legs, another by the arms, and together they hoist her up and carry her back to safety. The young man involved in the rescue who struggled to move Tom, well, he was a Vietnam veteran, and he was interviewed in the immediate aftermath. And you can tell that he's in this complete shock, as he said that he knew that Tom was dead, but he wasn't going to leave him there. Miraculously, after Claire was taken to safety, she was taken to the hospital where she did survive. But her baby did not, and neither did Tom. The big local news station at the time was KTBC, and as head reporter Neil Spouse learned what was unfolding at UT, he jumped into action. He got into the station's mobile news vehicle, known as the Red Rover, and began reporting live from the scene. And keep in mind, this was one of the earliest instances of a mass shooting being covered live as it was happening in real time over radio and television. And while that live reporting was going out over the airwaves, listening from home was a man named Ramiro Martinez, also known as Ray. Ray was an Austin police officer. He was off duty when he heard the news. But once he heard it, he did not hesitate. He immediately called his supervisor. He was like, hey, how can I help? His supervisor told him to go to the university and help direct traffic. So Martinez suited up and headed towards the tower. Officer Martinez later said that he assumed by the time he got there, the shooting would probably be over and that he would just be helping with the aftermath. But when he arrived, the shooting was still very much underway. And that is when his instincts and, frankly, his command mindset kicked in. He saw officers returning fire toward the tower, but they were too far away. And Martinez knew that they needed to get closer. His military training kicked in as he realized they needed a command center closer to the tower, maybe even inside of it. So that is exactly where he went, moving carefully so that he never gave the shooter a clean line of sight. Because Ray understood one very important thing. If he could see the tower, the shooter could see him. Officer Martinez entered the tower armed with nothing more than himself and his sidearm. Inside, he encountered a man named Alan Crum. The two men did not know each other, but after Alan got a hold of a long gun and made it clear to Martinez that he was willing to help, the two men teamed up to head upward and try to stop the shooting. So, who was Alan Crum? Alan Crum was a 40-year-old bookstore manager. He had been working at the co-op when he looked out and saw a disturbance around someone on the ground. At first, Alan thought, oh, that's not a big deal. Maybe there was some sort of fight. But eventually, as he kept looking, he decided to go and see what was going on. He went outside and got closer, and that's when he realized the young man on the ground was bleeding. Drawing on his own military experience, Alan improvised a tourniquet to try to help. He stayed with the injured person until an ambulance took over. After that, Alan could not simply return to the bookstore because doing so would have required him to step back into the line of fire. And so now that he realized what was really happening, he decided to move through connected buildings, trying to reach the tower to find a telephone so he could call his wife and let her know that he was safe, right? As he traveled through buildings, Alan found phones, landlines, by the way, but the lines were jammed. Everyone, it appeared, was trying to call home. So Alan kept it moving. And that is how he eventually ended up inside of the tower where he encountered Officer Martinez. There are slightly different accounts of exactly how this next part unfolded, but I'm using the general version told in documentaries and retroactive interviews to tell you what happened. And just as an FYI, there were already other officers making their way through the tower as this was happening, including two officers, one named Officer Jerry Day and a second officer, Officer Houston McCoy. Anyway, Martinez and Crum met amid the chaos on the lower levels of the tower, and Alan asked if he could help. At one point, a civilian handed Crum a rifle, and Martinez looked at Alan, then he looked at his own issued handgun, and basically decided, all right, come with me. Armed with a rifle and a handgun, Martinez and Crum took the elevator up to the 27th floor. Now, to get to the observation deck, which was on the 28th floor, they had to ride the elevator to the 27th floor. From there, they would access a stairwell that would take them up to the 28th floor. And then from the 28th floor, they would find themselves kind of like in a reception area, and they would have to go through another door that would eventually lead them out into the open air observation deck. So while they were riding the elevator, Officer Martinez later said that he prayed the entire way up because he didn't know what to expect. And as the elevator doors opened, the men raised their weapons immediately because they had no idea who or what would be waiting on the other side of those elevator doors. When the doors opened, they encountered Officer Day and Officer Houston McCoy. Everybody was relieved for about half a second, but there was no time to waste. They did a quick sweep and then moved toward the stairwell. Officer Martinez took the lead. Crum followed. And as they reached the first landing in the stairwell, they saw blood on the floors and walls. There were also spent shell casings everywhere. And on that stairwell, they came upon 4 victims from the same family. 2 were dead and 2 were wounded but still alive. The 2 deceased victims were 16-year-old Mark Gabor and his aunt, Margaret Lamport. The survivors were Mark's mother, Mary Gabor, and his older brother, Mike Gabor, who was a cadet at one of the service academies. Officer Martinez asked the surviving son how many shooters there were, and he indicated 1. And according to later accounts, that brother urged the officer to go get him. Sadly, we would come to find out that the Gabors had simply been visiting the university as tourists. They had no idea that they were walking into history. Well, at that point, the makeshift SWAT team pushed forward, and that's when they came upon a barricade. The sniper had shoved a heavy desk and other furniture into place to slow anyone who was coming after him. The men carefully and quietly moved the barricade aside and gained access to the reception area. And there, they came upon another victim. Edna Townsley was a longtime university employee who worked as a receptionist in the tower. But at that moment, when the officers found her, they couldn't stop to process the dead. They had to stop the gunman, so they found the final door leading outside. It was jammed, but they forced it open. At first, Martinez and Crum moved out onto the deck. They hugged the curve of the structure and looked around, but they did not immediately see the shooter. Then, as they advanced, Officer Houston McCoy joined them outside. The men stayed low against the hot concrete and behind the stone balustrade, trying to get eyes on the sniper. Meanwhile, outside the tower, armed civilians below were still firing toward the tower, not realizing that police officers were now up there and trying to help as well. But the makeshift SWAT team stayed low enough to avoid being hit by friendly fire. At one point, Crum fired toward where he believed the sniper might be positioned, hoping to force him to reveal himself. And it worked. The sniper fired back. And now the makeshift SWAT team had his location and the officers moved in. Officer Martinez spotted the sniper and opened fire with his handgun, unloading the remaining bullets without mercy. Officer McCoy fired his shotgun, striking the sniper as well. And as the sniper went down, Martinez grabbed McCoy's weapon and fired again to make sure the threat was over. The time was now 1:24 p.m. The shooting had started at 11:48 a.m. The total time of terror was 96 minutes, and now it was finally over. But below the tower, nobody knew that yet. Civilians were still firing upward. That is when Alan Crum grabbed a white handkerchief and waved it over the side. At first, some people thought the shooter was surrendering, but then word began to spread. The gunman was dead. The siege was over. Officer Martinez later explained that the moment it ended, his body just gave out, not emotionally at first, but physically. His legs felt like jello, and he was done. And while everyone was still trying to understand that the shooting had finally stopped, the magnitude of what had just happened was only beginning to sink in. Once people realized the danger had passed, students, teachers, pedestrians, and others nearby began moving toward the tower, not in a frenzy, not in celebration, just in pure shock. People wandered toward the scene like ghosts. Many said little or nothing at all. There was no hugging, there was no screaming, just blank stares. They looked like zombies trying to make sense of the impossible. And sadly, this massacre on a college campus would go down in history as one of the earliest modern mass shootings in America, and what many still describe as the first modern school shooting of its kind. After his death, the perpetrator of this horrific crime was identified as a 25-year-old former Marine and current UT student named Charles Whitman. On paper, Charles looked like the kind of kid that parents bragged about. Athletic, smart, good-looking. He was 6 foot tall, around 198 pounds, blonde hair, blue eyes, with the kind of smile that made him seem all-American. Charles was born in 1941 to Margaret and Charles Whitman Jr. He was the oldest of 3 boys. His father loved guns and hunting and introduced the boys to firearms relatively early. There is even a photograph of young 3-year-old Charles posed with rifles beside him. Later in life, Charles would write that he had not liked killing animals at first, but he did it anyways because he was always trying to impress his father. Raised in Florida, the Whitmans were a strict Catholic family. Charles was an altar boy, he was a Boy Scout, and not just any Boy Scout. He became an Eagle Scout at age 12, one of the youngest at the time. He started piano lessons at 5 years old, scored extremely high on standardized tests, and in his early school years, he was considered an above-average student. He played baseball, he was athletic, and by his teenage years, after years of shooting, he had developed into an exceptionally accurate marksman. The Whitmans were also financially comfortable. Charles Sr. built a successful plumbing business, and it did well enough to provide the family with a large home, nice cars, and even a backyard pool, which are luxuries that were not common for many families at the time. From the outside looking in, they looked ideal, like a poster card family. But perfect-looking families can hide the darkest secrets. And behind closed doors, Charles's childhood was marked by emotional and physical abuse at the hands of his father. His father demanded perfection and used violence to enforce it. Charles and his mother, Margaret, appeared to have been frequent targets of that abuse. By his junior and senior years of high school, people began noticing a shift in Charles' personality. And some accounts tie that change to a particular brutal beating by his father when Charles was still a teenager, like right before he turned 16 years old. One night, Charles broke curfew and came home late after being out with friends. He tried to sneak back in through the rear of the house, but his father was waiting for him. And what happened next was savage. His father attacked him, punched him hard enough to knock him to the ground, continued beating him while he was down, and then shoved him into the family pool. Charles was left in the water for a long time before pulling himself out. For years, he had wanted to escape his father's abuse. After that, the desire to leave only intensified. About a year after this incident, Charles was involved in a serious motorcycle accident. Some later writers have speculated about his mental state around that period, but speculation is all it is. What is clear is that by the end of high school, Charles was searching for a way out. And after graduating 7th in his class, he found one. He enlisted in the Marine Corps in 1959. Now, his father learned that he was enlisting. He was furious. He didn't want his son joining the military, but Charles left anyway. In the Marine Corps, Charles put his shooting skills to the test, and he qualified as a sharpshooter. He also did well enough academically and militarily to earn entry into the Naval Enlisted Science Education Program, which sent him to the University of Texas in 1961 to study engineering. While at UT, Charles met his future wife, Kathleen Leisner, known as Kathy. The two married in 1962. But Charles's grades slipped badly, and in February of 1963, his scholarship was revoked and he was ordered back to active duty as an enlisted Marine. And that's when they sent him to Camp Lejeune. Now, separated from his wife and stripped of the freedom he had enjoyed while in college, Charles appeared increasingly bitter. He drank heavily, he gambled to excess, and he got himself into a bit of trouble. During that time period, Whitman was court-martialed on charges that included gambling, usury, and unauthorized possession of a personal firearm. At the court-martial, he was convicted, demoted, and sentenced to confinement and hard labor. He was later honorably discharged from the Marine Corps in December of 1964. After leaving the Marines, Charles returned to Austin and re-entered UT, where he studied architectural engineering. But by then, people around him noticed he was not the same. Friends and family described mood swings, irritability, a shorter fuse, and increasingly severe headaches that sometimes caused intense blinding pain. Charles even told people he believed something might be wrong with his brain. And in early 1966, his mother finally left her abusive husband and moved to Austin to be closer to her son, Charles. And that mattered because from that point forward, Charles was caught in the middle. You see, his father repeatedly called him, trying to pressure him into persuading Margaret to return to Florida. So now Charles had his own instability, his mother nearby, his father constantly demanding things of him from a distance, and all of that tension building all at once. Then, in March of 1966, just a few months before the massacre, Charles did something that in that era was actually pretty unusual. He sought psychiatric help at the University Health Center. He met with Dr. Maurice Heatley. Charles described in that meeting his abusive upbringing, his parents' separation, his severe headaches, and his mounting violent thoughts. And then he said something chilling. He told Dr. Heatley that he had fantasized about climbing to the top of the tower with a rifle and just shooting people one by one. Now let that sink in. This man, no kidding, told a psychiatrist about a fantasy of committing a mass shooting from the very location where months later he would do exactly that. Now, to be fair to the psychiatrist, Charles Whitman did not present it as a formal plan, but listen, it was very specific. Very, very specific. At the time, though, there was no modern threat assessment team, no campus-wide intervention model like we think of today. And Dr. Heatley, based on the standards and context of the time, did not regard Whitman as an immediate threat. He documented that Whitman was angry, hostile, and full of resentment, especially toward his father, and that Whitman was asked to return for future help. However, he never did. Some later accounts also know that Whitman was prescribed Dexedrine around that period through University Medical Services. What is firmly documented is that Charles Whitman sought help for headaches and violent thoughts and then failed to show up. 4 months later, he carried out the very fantasy he had described. But wait, the day before the Tower Massacre, Charles Whitman sat down at a typewriter. He typed the date, July 31st. He typed the time, 6:45 p.m. And then he began putting his thoughts onto paper. What he wrote read like an explanation, a confession, and justification all in once. And it would become one of the most haunting pieces of documentary evidence left behind in the wake of this massacre. Because in that note, Whitman tried to explain why he had chosen to kill two of the people closest to him, his wife and his mother. Next time on Military Murder. True Crime Army, thank you so much for listening today. Be sure to come back next week where I will bring you the conclusion of this very tragic story. My sources for this story include various reportings by the Texas Tribune, the Daily Texan, PBS, Out of the Blue, BehindTheTower.org, Time Magazine, the Texas State Historical Association, KQED, The Washington Post, Texas Archives, UT Austin News, and the Tower documentary. Military Murder is a Mama Margot production. The music was created by Ty-Ops. Until next time, remember, you never really know what someone is capable of, so remain vigilant always. You have a fabulous week, and I'll keep digging to bring you the conclusion of this military murder story next week.
Mama's working on her podcast. I don't want to.